Hey, welcome to my home chalkboard here. In this section of the video, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the constructs that I mentioned in that section of the slides, where I'm talking about how everything in linguistics is basically a construct at some level. And so this is going to have lots of specific, narrow technical details about different concepts in basic linguistics, and the point is not for you to master everything there is to know about the theory of syllables and syllabification, or the theory of, English syntax and constituency, but it's to illustrate how even these sort of seemingly basic concepts within linguistics that we all feel like we have a pretty good intuitive appreciation of, even these very basic concepts really take a lot of work if you want to connect them to observable things out there in the world, that these really are constructs and that they're fairly abstract ones. And if you want to formulate and investigate meaningful and interesting questions about the structure of languages, you're going to have to do a lot of work at defining constructs and operationalizing them and their relationships to one another. I say as I drop the chalk on the floor. Let's see here, where'd that go? Wow, and I lost my chalk. Stuff. I had more though. So yeah, let's get started with the first one on that list is the syllable, right? And we all sort of have a pretty basic understanding of what a syllable is for the most part. I think people intuitively appreciate this. It's like you count the number of rhythmic units in a word, and that's how many syllables it has. So normally native speakers of a language have pretty good intuitions about how many syllables a given word has. So for instance, in English, if I give you the word, English, you're going to say how many syllables is that? You're going to say 2 syllables, English, or something like that. And sort of first basic approach to this would be, well, let's count the number of vowels in the word. Right? So I might represent that word phonetically as English with some kind of a reduced vowel in the second syllable. And yeah, it might look like this. And you can say, well, why do people think this has 2 syllables? It's because there's 1 vowel, 2 vowels. This is a schwa vowel. It's the unstressed vowel in English. And yeah, so this is how you count syllables, is you just look at the number of vowels, and that in and of itself would be a pretty simple basic linguistic concept. But the theory of syllables and syllabification in human languages actually goes well beyond this, because in phonology, normally when we talk about syllables, we're not just talking about the number of them in a word, but theoretically, there's also a grouping of all the sounds of a word into larger syllable units. So in English in particular, I'd probably put a syllable boundary between ing and glush. Right? So where are we getting that construct of a syllable from? I will tell you that there is no known way for you to make a recording of people saying words in English or any other language with syllables and just look at that recording and figure out how many syllables the word has. You can't do this. So it's not directly observable in the physical record. Instead, it seems to be part of our mental grammar, and it's a construct in theoretical linguistics that we use to try to tie together different kinds of facts about what is and isn't possible in a language. Right? And in particular, syllable theory basically says that every sound in a word is going to be affiliated to some larger constituent, a syllable, in particular ways, and this is going to be broadly the same across speakers, right? How do we know this? Well, the idea is that well-formed words in a language have to consist of sequences of well-formed syllables. It might be 1 syllable, it might be less than 1 syllable, but it sometimes also is going to be more than 1 syllable, and that the way that we know what's a well-formed syllable is by looking at words. So in particular, glush is a well-formed syllable in English, and we know this because gla is the possible beginning of a word. There are words in English like glad or glass or something like that. Therefore, we know that this is acceptable at the beginning of a syllable. Even though it's in the middle of a word, we can say, well, that's a well-formed beginning of a syllable. It's called an onset in syllable theory. We know that sh is a possible ending of a syllable because there are words like the one we're looking at here that end in the sound sh, therefore that must be an acceptable syllable ending. which is sometimes called the ending of a syllable, sometimes called a coda in syllable theory. Same thing for this engma sound here. This is a velar nasal eng, right? It's different from the coronal nasal na. It's sometimes called engma in phonetics. We know this is a possible ending of an English word because we have words like wing or something like that. And therefore, this word English can be broken into a sequence of well-formed syllables. English. That's why it's a well-formed English word. There's a systematic relationship between what kinds of sound sequences can occur in the middle of a word and what kinds of sound sequences can occur at the edge of words in a language. And we try to capture that relationship through the construct of a syllable. How do you operationalize syllable in this way? Well, it's going to have to do with the relationship between what kinds of sequences are judged to be well-formed in the mental grammar of a native English speaker internal to a word, and which ones are judged to be well-formed at the edge of a word. Right? Another argument that this has to be part of our implicit mental grammar is that it can't be something we're born with, because syllabification of this type differs between languages. Therefore, it's something that infants must need to learn from their native language as they're being exposed to it early in life. What's a good example of that? Well, if we take an English word like, let me think of a good one here. Let's see here. There's a form that you need to fill out to get financial aid at American universities, and it's called FAFSA. And it's pronounced FAFSA, and we would put this in phonetic script in this way. Definitely a well-formed word in English. No problem with this. FAFSA. Right? What about this FSA sequence? Well, are there any words in English that begin with a FSA sequence? There are not. There are no words like this in English. Therefore, for this one, we probably want to say that the syllable boundary is going to be between the f sound and the s sound, because f is a possible word ending in English, and s is a possible word beginning. Now, in Russian, on the other hand, are there words that begin with s? Indeed, there are. So, phonetically, the word for all in Russian is всё. No problem having this kind of a sequence in Russian. We would then predict that if a Russian speaker needed to pronounce a word like this with a FSA sequence in the middle of it, they would have the option of either keeping these syllables separated or of putting both sounds into the onset or the beginning of a syllable. It's going to be different than English. Similarly, in a word like actor, oops, I'm spelling instead of doing phonetics now. So here's how I might write the word actor in English. And here, English has words that end in ka. It has words that begin in ta. So these are two well-formed syllables. In English, there are no words that begin with kta. Right? And so we wouldn't say that this is a possible syllable structure for this word, with the break before ktor, or kter, something like that. Again, in Russian, either one's going to be possible, because Russian does have words that begin with kta sequences, like the word for who, kto. Right? So either possibility might be in play in Russian in terms of syllabifying this word, but it's going to work differently in English. Another example of this is that if you look at similar words in different languages, you'll often find that they have intuitively different numbers of syllables. Right? So if I ask you about the English word theater, most Americans are going to say this has two syllables. Right? Theater is going to be pronounced something like this. If you're British or if you're speaking extremely formally, you might have three syllables in here. The theater, or something like that. But for most Americans, it's two syllables. You ask about the same word in Russian, which I think is something like teatr. And actually, it occurs to me as I write this, there's probably going to be some degree of variation here. But for at least some Russian speakers, this could be one syllable, teatr. Right? even though in English it's clearly two. Very similar sound sequences here. For Russian speakers, there might also be a significant subset for whom this is two syllables. But interestingly, those two syllables are going to be here, theater, where ater is a single syllable, and these two vowels might be different, but you're never going to have this syllabic sound at the end in Russian. Similarly, in French, am I going to remember the word for theater in French? I think it's just théâtre, something like that. If you were going to write this phonetically, that R sound at the end of the word in French, following this voiceless stop, is actually a voiceless uvular fricative, ha. So this is going to be something like théâtre, right? And here, again, there might be two syllables here, but it's going to be these two vowels that are separated, where all of the final segments are going to be in the same syllable. So syllabification differs between languages, and even the perception of syllabification is going to differ depending on what kind of a language you speak. So I can list some more Russian words that aren't possible words in English. And I'm going to try to pronounce these. I'm probably not going to do a beautiful job. But the observation here is that not only do we not allow these words in English, but when you listen to them as an English speaker, you hear a certain number of syllables, and that's different than what a Russian speaker hears. So here's some examples. This is the word for mercury, the element in Russian, rtut. And I'm not pronouncing this beautifully, but it's my closest approximation, rtut. Here's a word for a kind of haze or fog. Mglia. And if I ask an English speaker, hey, here's a Russian word, rtut, how many syllables are in that? Most English speakers are going to say that's two syllables. Russian speakers, on the other hand, almost universally intuit that this is a single syllable. Similarly, for mglia, if I pronounce that to an English speaker and say, how many syllables, you're going to say, I have no idea, that sounds crazy. Maybe like two, maybe three syllables, mglia. A Russian speaker, again, is going to basically say there's one syllable in that word. So this is something that differs between languages. It's something that we must know as part of our implicit knowledge of language because it differs between languages. So even something as straightforward as a syllable actually has a huge amount of theory and constructs underlying it. Right? So that's the syllable. The next example here was a noun phrase, and this is going to be a syntactic example rather than a phonological one. What is a noun phrase? Well, intuitively, it's a group of words that all sort of describe or modify or pertain to some kind of a noun, which is the head of the phrase. But every single thing I just said is a pretty complicated construct. So what are we basing that on? Why do we think there are these phrases to begin with? How is it built around a particular word? And so on and so forth. The first thing to recognize here is that noun itself is a construct. You can't point at some properties of a word and say, look, there's a noun. Now, the way we intuitively think about this, we might have been taught in grammar school that a noun is a person, place, or thing. It turns out that actually when you look at real languages, it's much more complicated than that. So in syntax in particular, you'll learn that really the best way to think about these parts of speech or lexical categories like noun, verb, adjective is based on their syntactic distribution in a language. It's not actually based on their meaning, although meaning can be helpful for thinking about the different categories. And in fact, it's not even totally clear in modern syntactic theory that noun in and of itself is really denoting a specific set of words. It actually might be a useful concept for thinking about different languages, but where the concept noun is going to be slightly different in every different language you look at. In any case, that's level one of it being a construct. Let's assume that we've basically solved that issue. Now, what's the observation? Why do we think a noun phrase is a noun phrase? Well, let's just randomly write an English sentence here. I'm in a Russian state of mind, so I'm going to say I read a book by Tolstoy. Actually, let's make it the book by Tolstoy. This is going to be a little bit easier to deal with. And when did I do that reading? Last week. So one of the noun phrases in this sentence is going to be the book by Tolstoy. And we're going to say that it's headed by the noun book. Right? And why do we think that? Well, there's an observation here that you can do various things to English sentences to have them bear a specified relationship to other English sentences. And so some of the things I can do here, for instance, are substitute this element with various other things. There's a book by Tolstoy. I read it last week. So I can substitute in a pronoun for this entire phrase. And interestingly, not every sequence of words in an English sentence behaves this way. Only some do. So I can substitute it for this collection of words. I can't do it for read the book by Tolstoy. I it yesterday. No way. Ungrammatical in English. So these all pattern together in the grammar in a way that these ones don't. I can't do this for read the. That definitely won't work. I it book by Tolstoy yesterday. Totally ungrammatical. Similarly, you can extract some of these and ask questions of them, of constituents only, in a way that you can't for non-constituents. So, what did you read last week? What did you read last week? Here I've taken the entire phrase, the book by Tolstoy, substituted what for it, and put what at the beginning of the sentence. This is referred to as WH movement in English, and you'll get some detailed look at this in your syntax class. I can also give this as a standalone answer to that question. What did you read last week? The book by Tolstoy. No problem. This is all a big element that patterns together in English syntax in a way that, say, read the does not, right? So I can't ask, what did you do book by Tolstoy last week? Read the. Yeah, it doesn't work. Absolutely not. And so there's various tests of these kinds. We call these constituency tests. That can show you that some words in an English sentence pattern together in the grammar in a way that other strings of words do not. We call these constituents that pattern together, constituents, but in this case, it's a particular phrase. What do we mean that it's headed by the noun book? Well, this is a little bit complicated, but here's a quick illustration of the kind of thing that we mean. Let's take this and make it the subject of a sentence. The book by Tolstoy seems interesting, or something like that. If we change the features of this head noun, let's say we make it plural, that's going to change the syntax of the entire phrase. The books by Tolstoy seem interesting. The book by Tolstoy seems interesting. So the entire sequence of words, this constituent, the noun phrase, is going to take its singleness or pluralness from the head noun. Now you can change the number of this other noun inside here, and it doesn't change the number of the entire phrase. So the book by the man Tolstoy seems interesting, still singular agreement. The book by 6 Russian authors seems interesting. If you make this plural, the whole thing doesn't become plural. That's because this entire unit, this noun phrase, is inheriting some of its features from the head noun book and not from other words inside it. So this is what we mean when we say that something is a noun phrase and that it's headed by a particular noun. This is the kind of fact we're talking about. What were some other examples here? Oh yeah, these ones are going to involve less narrow technical detail, but one of the things I've been implicitly appealing to while trying to define these first two constructs is the notion of grammatical or acceptable sentence, right? And that can be, in this case, I really am talking about sentences. These strings of words work and these other strings of words don't. Obviously, that's a construct. If you want to know whether something is a grammatical or acceptable sentence, you need to actually ask a native speaker of the language or plausibly a large number of native speakers and analyze the results. Now, for things like I read it last week, those kinds of acceptability judgments are so straightforward and obvious to any native English speaker that we generally don't run formal experiments to figure out whether that's acceptable or not. We just know that it is. But there can be much more complicated judgments that you might want to appeal to when you're trying to describe some language, where you really would want to run a formal experiment to ask, hey, do speakers of language X accept this sentence or reject it? That's also quite common in the phonological literature, where again, it's pretty straightforwardly the case that English speakers won't accept ktaf as a possible word in English. But if you really wanted to know the factors that go into what kinds of sequences of sounds make good fake words in English, you can absolutely run a detailed experiment where you ask them to rate how good does this sound as an English word, and do it with hundreds of speakers and hundreds of words. People have done this, right? We're applying to some, we're appealing to some notion of this is allowed in my language versus this is not allowed in my language. But because we're studying people's implicit mental grammars or their knowledge of their languages, you can't look out in the world and grab that out of their head. You have to find a particular way of getting access to particular facts about acceptability and grammaticality. So even when you see people saying like, this is grammatical or not grammatical in some language, this is really shorthand for we can get acceptability judgments from speakers of this language that reflect some underlying facts about the structure of what the language does or does not generate as a well-formed structure. Right? So this is really, even grammaticality itself is a pretty abstract construct within linguistics. The last one here was a specific language like English, and I mentioned this briefly, but if you go out and interview 170 speakers of American English, all from West Virginia, there's going to be a certain amount of variability in how much or how little people accept this. And same is true with any pattern of linguistic acceptability judgments. You're never going to find that two people have exactly the same set of structures that are allowed in their English as their neighbor does. There's always going to be tiny differences, whether those differences are quantitative or qualitative. There is no such thing as the English language as a single grammar that exists inside everybody's head. That in and of itself is a construct, right? And so what do we actually mean when we say that English allows it to substitute for a noun phrase? Well, we're referring to some extremely large group of people. In this case, I said American English, so they're going to be mostly in North America, who speak languages with enough similarities. They possess mental grammars with enough similarities that they are able to effectively agree on many acceptability judgments, and all of those shared agreements we will refer to as American English, even though we recognize that the specific mental grammars inside every individual's head may be slightly different, and that if you probe far enough, you'll find variability even with simple judgments like this. Nonetheless, if more than one speaker shares enough common implicit knowledge about the structure of their language, it's harmless for the moment to treat it as being a language, the American English language. The same is true for every other language in the world, right? So even this idea of like, I'm going to learn English in the classroom, English is very much a construct there. What are you learning? Is it this person's grammar, that person's grammar, enough shared conventions over global Englishes that we can think of it as being a very broad, general, global English grammar? It's not totally clear. There is even some abstractness and complexity in the notion of the English language or any other language as well. So this is my attempt to show that really everything in linguistics is constructs. It's constructs all the way down, because we're never really studying things that you can point to in the world. We're not even studying letters on a blackboard. What we're studying is people's implicit knowledge about the languages that they speak, whether they acquired those as infants in their native languages, or whether they acquired them as adults in their foreign languages, or some complex place in between the two extremes, right, for bilinguals or balanced bilinguals or whatever. What we're really talking about is the implicit knowledge that exists inside their heads, and so everything is a construct, and it's all going to need to be related to things that we can study out there in the world before we can make statements about constructs. And so, for instance, some of the examples I put in the slide, English allows closed syllables. What does that mean? A closed syllable is a syllable with a consonant in its final position. And if you wanted to support that, we could come back to examples like actor, where I said that the syllable break is probably here in English. And we can observe that, well, if you were going to say how syllables work in English, and they're going to work based on the beginnings and endings of words, kta is not a possible word beginning in English, unlike in Russian. And so we're going to have to say that this is at the end of the first syllable, this k sound, and the t sound is at the beginning of the second syllable. That means that this syllable ends in a consonant sound, ak. Therefore, English allows closed syllables. Similarly, you can look at the end of a word. This one ends with The status of this as a consonant versus a vowel is actually a little bit less clear in American English, but let's pretend for the moment that it's a consonant. Then if the word ends in a consonant and words are sequences of well-formed syllables, then this better be a closed syllable. Right? So this is what we mean when we say that English has closed syllables or allows closed syllables. It's really a pretty complicated chain of inferences over syllable theory itself, the relationship between sequences inside words and sequences at the edges of words, and your sort of theory of how well-formed words are put together within a language. There's always an implicit theory behind statements that use constructs like syllable, closed syllable, and so on and so forth. Another example what was the example here? That English noun phrases require determiners, was that it? Spanish noun phrases require determiners. So again, all sorts of different constructs in here, starting with Spanish, right? Because as any Spanish speakers in the class know, there is a huge variety of different kinds of Spanish that are spoken all over the world, and certainly their sound systems are going to be quite different from one another in some cases. Possibly their syntactic systems will as well. I know less about that because it's pretty far from my own expertise as a linguist, but it's entirely possible that, Dominican Spanish or Cibaeño Spanish has somewhat different properties governing its noun phrases than, Andalusian Spanish. It's hard to say. You'd have to study it. But what do we mean when we say broadly that Spanish noun phrases require determiners? Well, we can look at a number of syntactic constructions where in some languages you can get bare noun phrases that have no determiners in them. And determiners are words that basically specify which members of a set of nouns you're talking about. So in English, this is words like the, a, some, a few, things like that. These are determiners. They're sometimes referred to as articles in traditional grammar. And the observation here is that in English, most noun phrases or many noun phrases have determiners in them, but some don't. Sometimes you don't need a determiner. So for instance, I ate snow. This is a possible sentence of English, fully grammatical, no determiner on this guy. And then the question is, in Spanish, if you were trying to convey this meaning, what would the sentence look like? And I think the answer is that there'd need to be some sort of modifier before the word, what is it, nievas, snow, something like that, nieve? Now I'm forgetting all my Spanish, but you'd have to say something that corresponds to a determiner, either I ate the snow or I ate some snow or something like that. Similarly, in English, you can say, actually, let me change this to something. This is going to be almost the same example. Let me think of a different kind of example. In English, you can say things like, let me pick one that I actually know how to say in Spanish. Let's say biology. Right? Biology is interesting. And here, again, this subject biology is a noun phrase that has no determiner. You don't have to say the biology is interesting in English, you say biology is interesting. In Spanish, I think this would need a definite determiner. La biología es interesante, or something like that. And this is what the phrase is going to mean. You're basically, what the claim about the construct is, you're going to have to first operationalize what's a determiner, explain what it means to be required, and then pick out some plausible cases where cross-linguistically you might not find determiners on noun phrases, and show that in some comparable variety of context in Spanish, you do find determiners. Now, not to ruin the surprise, but if you do this long enough, you'll find out that the claim is false in some cases. There are places in Spanish where you can have noun phrases with no determiners. They're just more limited than they would be in English. Right? And then if you look in other languages, you'll find even more complex patterns. So in particular, in Russian, which several people in here speak, several of these determiners, namely a and the, are either non-existent in Russian or silent. And so you'll find even more complex facts about bare noun phrases in Russian. But the point is to examine any of these hypotheses, you need to have certain constructs in place. What counts as a determiner? What would it mean for a determiner to be required versus not required? What kind of structural contexts exist in your language? What is the language? And so on and so forth. Now the final example from that slide involves WH movement out of noun phrases in English. And I don't want to go through this in super detail because it's really complicated. I could give a 3-hour lecture on how this works in English. But I will just briefly illustrate the kinds of facts that it's talking about. So first of all, what is WH movement? Well, it refers back to this thing I put up here briefly when I was talking about constituent structure, that there are correspondences between statements in English and questions where you can see that certain kinds of question words, which we often refer to as WH words in English syntax, can stand in for entire groups of words that are constituents, and you form questions by substituting in these WH words for constituents and positioning them at the beginning of a sentence. That's sometimes referred to as movement, WH movement, even though it's not meant to be a literal physical analogy of like moving your arm or something. So that's one kind of a construct. And then we're claiming that WH movement out of a noun phrase is unacceptable or ungrammatical in English. What does that mean? Well, we're going to have this construct of WH movement. We already went through the construct of noun phrase in English. And what does it mean to come out of a noun phrase? Well, I guess the claim would be that questions where the WH word corresponds to some substring of words that was inside a noun phrase is going to be ungrammatical in English. So what could that look like? Well, let's go back to this example, or it's going to be a slightly different one. So, the book about Russia was interesting. That's a well-formed sentence in English. This is going to be a big noun phrase with a little noun phrase inside it. All right, so the book about Russia is going to pattern like a constituent by the operationalization of noun phrase that I introduced earlier. And so is Russia. But watch this. What if you try to question this noun phrase here that's inside a bigger noun phrase? If I want to question the whole thing, that's easy. What was interesting? The book about Russia was interesting. What if I try to take just this one out? Where was the book about interesting? This is an extremely iffy, and most people would say ungrammatical sentence of English. And the reason why, plausibly, I mean, we have to investigate further, but one hypothesis is that WH movement out of a noun phrase is ungrammatical in English. Right? So this is the kind of operationalization that we need to start looking at. Notice that these kinds of judgments are going to get increasingly tricky and complex as we're investigating more and more elaborate structural hypotheses. This is very different from "I read it," which pretty much everybody can instantly understand is a perfectly acceptable sentence of English. Now we're asking about less stable and more fuzzy intuitions about the well-formedness of questions, and at some point maybe we want to adapt a more laboratory approach to figuring this out. But either way, these are the kinds of examples you're going to need to investigate to evaluate complex statements about constructs.